I stood on the cracked driveway of my grandmother Evelyn Hargrove's Victorian house and felt like my entire world had collapsed. The house sat proudly on Willow Creek Lane, just as it always had. The white porch, the flower beds, and the old swing Grandma loved were all still there. But somehow, it no longer felt like home. Across the yard, Diane and Lorraine Whitaker were laughing as movers carried boxes through the front door. They acted like they had won a prize. In their eyes, they had. Just 3 hours earlier, the court had ruled in their favor. After months of legal battles, arguments, and endless paperwork, I had lost everything. The house that Grandma had spent her whole life protecting was no longer mine. I watched Lorraine point toward the porch while giving instructions to the movers. Diane stood beside her with a satisfied smile. Neither of them looked at me. They didn't have to. Their victory was already complete. What hurt even more was knowing that I had recently lost my marriage too. Tyler, their son, had chosen them over me. The divorce papers were already signed. The life I thought I was building had disappeared piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. I carried a small cardboard box in my arms. It contained old photographs, a few letters, and a worn recipe book that had belonged to Grandma. Those were the only things I had managed to keep. Everything else stayed behind. For a moment, I looked toward the porch where Grandma and I used to sit during summer evenings. I could almost hear her voice and see her gentle smile. A memory suddenly came back to me. A few months before she passed away, Grandma had squeezed my hand and said something I never fully understood. People who lie may win for a little while, Brooke, but the truth is patient. When the time comes, fight the quiet way. Back then, I thought she was simply sharing one of her life lessons. Standing there now, I wondered if she had been trying to warn me. I wiped away my tears, placed the box carefully in my car, and took one last look at the house. Then I drove away. At that moment, I believed I had lost everything. I had no idea that Grandma's fight wasn't over yet. 6 months before I stood in that driveway, I sat inside a quiet lawyer's office expecting a difficult day, but not a war. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. A long wooden table separated the family members. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, still grieving Grandma Evelyn. Losing her had left a hole in my life that nothing could fill. The attorney opened a folder and began reading her will. My heart pounded as I listened. Grandma had left me the Victorian house, the surrounding land, and her savings. The words were clear. There was no confusion, no conditions, no questions. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. Then Diane pushed her chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. "That's impossible," she snapped. Lorraine immediately joined in. They claimed Evelyn had made different promises to them over the years. They insisted the property was supposed to be shared. Their voices grew louder with every sentence. The attorney calmly reminded them that the will was legally signed and witnessed. That should have ended the discussion. Instead, Diane pulled several papers from her bag. Lorraine handed over written statements from people who supposedly knew Evelyn's wishes. I stared at the documents in disbelief. I had never seen any of them before. The attorney reviewed everything with a serious expression and said the claims would need to be investigated. That was the moment everything changed. The meeting stopped being about honoring Grandma. It became a fight over what she had left behind. I looked toward Tyler, hoping he would say something. He knew how close Evelyn and I had been. He knew how much that house meant to me. But he remained quiet. When Diane accused me of manipulating an old woman, Tyler lowered his eyes and said nothing. That silence hurt more than the accusation itself. Soon other relatives began taking sides. Some said I was selfish. Others claimed I only cared about money. People I had shared holidays with suddenly looked at me like a stranger. After losing my parents when I was young, I had believed I finally belonged somewhere. Tyler's family had become my family. At least, that was what I thought. By the end of the meeting, the estate was frozen until the dispute could be settled. No one spoke to me as they left. I sat alone in the conference room, staring at the empty chair where Grandma should have been. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about an inheritance. Someone was willing to rewrite her final wishes. And they had already started. A few months before Evelyn passed away, life still felt normal. One warm afternoon, I sat with her on the sun porch behind the Victorian house. The windows were open, letting in a soft breeze that carried the smell of fresh flowers from the garden she loved so much. At 87 years old, Grandma was slower than she used to be, but her mind remained sharp. Nothing escaped her attention. She was working on a quilt while I helped sort old family photographs into boxes. For a while, we talked about simple things. The weather, the neighbors, a recipe she wanted me to learn. Then her mood changed. She placed the quilt aside and picked up an old photograph from the table. I noticed she stared at it longer than usual. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. If people ever disappoint you, what would you do?" The question seemed strange. I laughed lightly. "I don't know. Depends on what they did." She nodded but didn't smile. "Sometimes the people closest to you can surprise you." I looked at her, confused. She rarely spoke in riddles. "Did someone hurt you?" I asked. For a moment, she stayed quiet. Then she slowly folded her hands together. "A long time ago, someone tried to take something that belonged to me," she said. "Who?" She shook her head. "That part doesn't matter anymore." I waited for her to continue. "It wasn't a stranger," she said. "That's what made it painful." The answer left me uneasy. Grandma had always seemed strong and fearless. It was hard to imagine anyone taking advantage of her. "What happened?" A small smile appeared on her face. "I survived it." That was all she said. No names. No details. Nothing more. I remember feeling frustrated because she was being mysterious again. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Listen carefully, Brooke." I stopped smiling when I heard the seriousness in her voice. "Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Family names don't guarantee loyalty either." I stared at her. The words felt unusually heavy. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because one day you may need to remember it." I told her she was worrying about things that would never happen. She looked toward the yard for a moment before turning back to me. "If trouble ever comes, don't fight with anger. Don't fight to hurt people. Fight the quiet way." "The quiet way?" "The kind that lasts." I laughed softly. "You're acting like I'm about to go into battle." She finally smiled. "Maybe not today." I hugged her before leaving that evening. At the time, I thought it was simply another life lesson from a wise grandmother. I had no idea she was preparing me for something already moving toward us. And I had no idea how much those words would matter later. It was just before Thanksgiving when I drove back to Willow Creek Lane. The air was cold enough to sting my hands through the steering wheel. I had baked a pumpkin pie that morning because I still couldn't accept silence between me and the house that once felt like home. The Victorian looked different as I turned into the driveway. The porch lights were changed. The curtains inside were new. Even the front door had a different color handle. I slowed down, confused, and stepped out of the car with the pie carefully balanced in my hands. When I reached the door, my key didn't fit. I tried again, thinking maybe I was using the wrong one, but the lock had been changed. Before I could react, the door opened from inside. Lorraine stood there wearing Evelyn's old kitchen apron, the same one I had seen Grandma wear for years while baking bread. Lorraine was holding a stack of silverware like she owned the place. She looked at me without surprise. "Oh," she said flatly. "You're here." Behind her, I could hear movement in the house. Boxes opening, chairs shifting, voices deciding where things should go. I stepped closer. "What is going on?" Diane appeared from the hallway, holding a clipboard. She didn't even greet me. "We needed to organize things properly," she said, as if it explained everything. I looked past them into the house. The dining table was covered with papers, labels, and stacks of items from the kitchen drawers. Evelyn's teacups were already packed into boxes. "This is still my grandmother's house," I said. Diane gave a short laugh. "Not anymore." Before I could respond, Tyler walked in from the kitchen. I felt relief for a second. He was here. He would fix this. But his eyes didn't meet mine for long. "It's temporary," he said quietly. "We're just sorting things out until everything is settled." "Temporary?" I repeated. He nodded once, but it didn't feel like confidence. It felt like distance. I looked at him, waiting for him to stand beside me, to say something that made sense. Instead, he turned slightly toward his mother. That small movement said everything before his words did. Diane continued giving instructions behind him like I wasn't even part of the conversation anymore. My hands tightened around the pie dish. No one asked me to come in. No one made space for me. I stood there for a few more seconds, watching them move through the house like it already belonged to them. Then I turned around. I walked back to my car without another word. The pie sat untouched on the passenger seat as I started the engine. Before driving away, I looked once more at the house where I thought I was building a future. My eyes blurred as I pulled out of the driveway. Behind me, the Victorian lights stayed on, but nothing about it felt warm anymore. The apartment I moved into was small, almost empty, and far away from Willow Creek Lane. The walls were thin, and I could hear every sound from the next unit. A leaking tap. A baby crying at odd hours. A television that never turned off. But the worst part was the silence after I closed my door. There was no porch. No garden. No smell of Evelyn's cooking. Only a single window that looked out onto a narrow street where people passed without looking up. At night, I sat on the floor because I didn't even have enough furniture yet. I kept a small box beside me. Inside were things I had managed to bring with me from the house, old photographs, a few handwritten recipes, and a piece of fabric Evelyn once gave me. I would touch them just to feel something familiar. Memories came back without warning. Evelyn standing beside me in her kitchen, showing me how to fold dough properly, her voice correcting me gently when I made mistakes, her eyes narrowing when she said, "Look at how a person acts, not what they say." Those moments now felt like they belonged to another life. Days passed like that. Then the legal pressure started again. I received notices almost every other day. Papers filled with accusations. Statements from people I barely knew. Later I found out Diane and Lorraine were going door to door in the neighborhood near the house. They spoke to people I had once trusted. Some of them changed their stories. Some said things I knew weren't true. But I had no strength left to fight every lie. One evening, I returned from buying groceries and saw Tyler standing outside my apartment. He wasn't smiling. He held an envelope in his hand. For a moment, I couldn't move. I already knew what it was before he spoke. "I think this is the best way forward," he said quietly. His voice was careful, like he was reading something prepared. I took the envelope from him. My name was printed on it clearly. Divorce papers. I looked at him, waiting for something human to break through his calm expression. But he avoided my eyes. "I can't keep going like this," he added. The words didn't feel real. They felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. I walked past him into my apartment without saying anything. That night, I sat on the floor again, holding the papers in my hands. The room felt smaller than before. Every memory I had was tied to people who were now gone from my life. When morning came, I signed my name. My hand didn't shake because I felt strong. It didn't shake because I had nothing left to lose. After that, I didn't cry anymore. There was nothing left in me that had the energy for it. The courtroom felt colder than I remembered when I stepped inside that morning. Everything sounded sharp, like even footsteps had weight. I sat at the table with my lawyer, staring at the polished wood in front of me, trying to keep my breathing steady. Across the room, Diane and Lorraine looked calm. Too calm. They whispered to each other sometimes, then stopped when they noticed me watching. Tyler's seat was empty. That emptiness said more than anything he could have spoken. The hearing began quickly. Papers were presented, statements were read, and voices rose and fell in controlled rhythm. I listened, but it felt like I was hearing everything through water. Diane spoke first. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, as she described years of care and support for Evelyn. Lorraine nodded beside her, adding small details that painted them as the only people who had truly been there. Then came their witnesses. People I recognized from the neighborhood. Some avoided my eyes completely. Others looked uncomfortable but still repeated what they had been told. My lawyer tried to respond, but every point felt buried under louder claims. When I spoke, I kept my voice steady. I explained what I knew. I explained what I had lived. I mentioned Evelyn's will, her handwriting, her intentions. But the judge listened quietly, expression unreadable. Hours passed like that. At one point, I glanced toward the empty chair where Tyler should have been sitting. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. Finally, the judge spoke. His decision was based on long-term caregiving claims and community testimony. He said the evidence presented by the Whitakers carried more weight in this case. The words landed slowly, like they didn't belong to me. The house, the land, the savings, everything was ruled in their favor. For a moment, I couldn't move. Diane exhaled like she had been holding her breath for months. Lorraine's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. They didn't celebrate loudly. They didn't need to. It was already theirs. I stood up slowly, gathering my folder, but my hands felt disconnected from my body. No one stopped me as I walked out. The hallway outside the courtroom was long and bright, but it felt empty. Each step away from that room felt heavier than the last. I reached the exit and paused for a second, looking back once. Then I left the building without turning around again. Outside, the air hit my face, but I didn't feel it properly. Everything I had fought for was gone. Not just a house. Something deeper had been erased with it. Months passed in a slow, heavy blur. I went to the county clerk's office one afternoon with a stack of tax forms I didn't really care about. The building was quiet, filled with the sound of turning pages and typing keyboards. It felt like a place where time moved differently, slower and colder. I stood at the counter waiting for my turn when the clerk, a woman named Rosa, glanced at my papers. She paused at the address. "That place," she said, almost to herself, "has history." I looked up slightly. What kind of history? She hesitated, then gave a small shrug like she wasn't sure she should say more. Old disputes. Long records. Sometimes things come back around. Something in her tone made me uneasy. Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked toward the back shelves. I almost ignored it. I should have. But I stayed. A few minutes later, Rosa returned carrying a dusty box. Inside were rolled files and old microfilm reels. She placed one of them on a reader machine nearby. "This might interest you," she said. I didn't understand why she was doing this for me, but I sat down anyway. The screen flickered before an old scanned document appeared. At first, it was just names and dates I didn't recognize. The ink looked faded, the pages slightly damaged. Then I saw the address. My breath slowed. Willow Creek Lane. I leaned closer. The document described a legal dispute from more than 40 years ago. A widow fighting to keep her home after her husband's death. A man claiming rights that didn't belong to him. Papers being questioned. Signatures being challenged. My eyes moved faster as I read line after line. The widow's name appeared. Evelyn Hargrove. My hands went cold. I sat completely still, staring at the screen. The case wasn't just similar. It was almost identical. A family member had tried to take her property using forged documents and false claims. People had been convinced. The court had been pressured. Her home had nearly been lost, but she fought it. And she won. I could barely breathe as Rosa quietly said, "I think that's the same family name attached to your file now." Her voice felt far away. I kept reading, unable to stop. There were notes about hearings, objections, and recovered evidence. Even mentions of hidden records that had overturned the case at the last moment. My chest tightened. This wasn't random. This wasn't new. It had happened before. And somehow, I had walked into the same fight without knowing it. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the faded words on the screen, feeling like the ground under me had shifted. Everything I thought was lost didn't feel finished anymore. It felt like it was only half of a story I was never told. The archive room was silent except for the faint hum of the old machine in front of me. I stayed there long after Rosa left, going through every page they brought out for me. Dust clung to my fingers, and the air smelled like old paper and forgotten time. The more I read, the harder it became to sit still. Evelyn's case file was thicker than I expected. Every page carried her handwriting, official stamps, and legal notes that felt strangely personal. At first, it looked like a normal dispute record. But as I continued, patterns began to appear. Words repeated. Names crossed out. References to missing documents that were later recovered. Then I found it. A sealed affidavit attached to the final pages. My hand slowed as I opened it. The writing inside was not just legal language. It felt direct, almost like she was speaking through the page. Evelyn described what she had gone through decades ago. Not just the fight over property, but the betrayal from people she once trusted. She wrote about how easily truth could be twisted when greed entered a family. Line after line, she explained how she refused to let history repeat itself. She had prepared for it. Not in fear, but in certainty that people like that would return someday. My eyes moved faster as I reached the section that mentioned protections she had built into everything she owned afterward. Extra clauses. Hidden instructions. Verified recordings stored in official custody. It said clearly that her true intention could not be erased, even if someone tried to rewrite it. My breath stopped when I saw my name. Evelyn had named me directly in the document, not as an afterthought, as the one she trusted. There were notes attached to my inheritance rights that I had never known existed. Safeguards layered under legal systems I didn't even understand. Instructions meant to activate only if her will was ever challenged in the same way she once faced. My fingers trembled as I kept reading. It felt like she was still here, speaking to me through every sentence. Not softly, but firmly, protecting even from beyond what she had already lost once in life. I could almost picture her sitting at her desk, writing each line with patience and anger held under control. Tears blurred my vision as I leaned back in the chair. It didn't feel like I was reading history anymore. It felt like she had reached across time to make sure I wasn't alone in this. And for the first time in a long while, something inside me shifted. I returned to the courthouse with a different kind of silence inside me. Not the broken silence I once carried, but something steady, controlled. Like I finally understood the shape of what I was holding. The file I placed on the lawyer's table was thicker than anything I had brought before. Every page felt heavier than it should have been, as if the past itself had weight. When the case reopened, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted immediately. Diane and Lorraine noticed it too. Their faces tightened the moment they saw the documents being arranged. Tyler arrived late. He stepped inside like someone unsure where he belonged anymore. His eyes moved toward me first, then quickly away, like he couldn't decide whether to stand near me or disappear. I didn't react. The hearing began again, but this time the tone was different. The old records were introduced first. The clerk read out dates, signatures, and archived filings that no one in the room had expected to resurface. I watched the judge lean forward slightly as each page was reviewed. Then the sealed affidavit was opened. The same patterns from decades ago were now clear in front of everyone. Attempts to alter ownership, conflicting statements, documents that matched too closely across time to be ignored. Diane shifted in her seat. Lorraine stopped smiling. When their witnesses were called again, something changed. One by one, they began adjusting their statements. Some admitted they were asked to help clarify things. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few even withdrew their earlier claims. The structure they built started to fall apart in small pieces. Tyler stood up once, trying to speak to me outside the formal process. His voice was lower than before, almost careful. "I made a mistake," he said. I looked at him for a moment. There was no anger left in me for him. Only distance. "I can't fix this," he added. "You already chose," I replied quietly. That was all I said. Back inside, Diane's voice cracked for the first time when she tried to defend their position. Lorraine's hands trembled as she held her papers too tightly. The judge called for a recess after inconsistencies piled up faster than anyone could manage. In the hallway, I could hear fragments of conversations. Lawyers speaking faster. Witnesses rethinking what they had said. The pressure they once controlled had reversed. When we returned, the case no longer felt balanced. It felt exposed. Every claim they made now had a shadow behind it. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't the one defending myself. I was simply watching the truth do what it had always been waiting to do. The final hearing did not feel like the beginning of anything new. It felt like the end of something that should have never lasted this long. When the decision was announced, the courtroom stayed quiet for a moment before the weight of it settled across every seat. Diane and Lorraine no longer looked confident. Their papers lay scattered in front of them, untouched. Tyler remained still, saying nothing at all. The ruling was clear. The earlier decision was overturned. Every claim built against me collapsed under the restored records and verified filings. The ownership of the Victorian, the land, and everything tied to Evelyn's estate was returned to me without condition. I did not speak when it ended. I only listened until the last instruction was read. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but no longer pressing against my chest the way it used to. When I reached Willow Creek Lane again, the porch stood in front of me like it was waiting. The same steps I once left in tears now felt steady under my feet. I opened the door. The house was quiet, empty of noise, but not empty of memory. Later that day, I saw Diane and Lorraine outside with moving boxes. They moved slowly, avoiding eye contact, their voices lower than before. No one was celebrating anymore. The sharpness they once carried was gone, replaced by something uneasy and heavy. I did not stop to watch for long. Some things don't need to be seen twice. Instead, I drove to the cemetery. Evelyn's grave was simple, surrounded by grass that moved gently in the wind. I stood there for a long time before speaking. From my bag, I took the old affidavit I had found in the archives, the same pages that had changed everything. My voice was quiet as I read her words aloud, not like a legal document, but like a message that had finally reached its destination. When I finished, I stayed still for a while. It felt like she was there in a way I couldn't explain. Not in sound or sight, but in the way everything had finally made sense. I told her I would keep the house. I told her I would not let it become a battlefield again. I told her I would build something different there, something that would not break the same way. The wind moved through the trees as if answering. When I returned to Willow Creek Lane, I unlocked the door and stepped inside without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, the house did not feel taken. It felt returned.